Hello and welcome to Close Reading Classic Literature with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. Does Lydia Bennet's elopement with Mr Wickham come out of nowhere? Or did Lydia Bennet always have her eye on Mr Wickham? In this video, I'm going to answer these questions by close reading the text of Pride and Prejudice. After the fallout from the elopement of Lydia Bennet and Mr Wickham, Elizabeth Bennet, Lydia's sister, reflects that she had never perceived, while the regiment was in Hertfordshire, that Lydia had any partiality for him. But she was convinced that Lydia wanted only encouragement to attach herself to anybody. Sometimes one officer, sometimes another had been her favourite, as their attentions raised them in her opinion. Her affections had continually been fluctuating, but never without an object. But is Lizzie correct? Had Lydia, in fact, shown any partiality for Mr Wickham? Let's see. From the moment the militia arrives in Meryton, Lydia Bennet's head is occupied with any and all officers, particularly one Captain Carter. And it's interesting, I think, that right from the very introduction of the militia, they are described in terms and in relation to Lydia Bennet and Kitty Bennet. As though from the very kind of introduction of the militia into the novel, we see them associated with Lydia in particular and Kitty too. And in the course of this video, I'm going to be talking a lot about Lydia and Kitty, but it's worth thinking about why the narrative voice puts together Lydia and Kitty so often in the minds of Lizzie Bennet, for example, or Mr Bennet, for example, why they are often sort of shoehorned together and what that might obscure for the first-time reader. But getting back to the introduction of the militia to Meryton, at present, indeed, they, Lydia and Kitty, were well supplied both with news and happiness by the recent arrival of a militia regiment in the neighbourhood. It was to remain the whole winter, and Meryton was the headquarters. Their visits to Mrs Phillips is their aunt, the sister of Mrs Bennet. Their visits to Mrs Phillips were now productive of the most interesting intelligence. Every day added something to their knowledge of the officers' names and connections. Their lodgings were not long a secret, and at length they began to know the officers themselves. Mr Phillips visited them all, and this opened to his nieces a source of felicity unknown before. They could talk of nothing but officers, and Mr Bingley's large fortune, the mention of which gave animation to their mother, was worthless in their eyes when opposed to the regimentals of an ensign. An ensign is the lowest ranking officer. After listening one morning to their effusions on this subject, Mr Bennet coolly observed, "From all that I can collect of your manner of talking, you must be two of the silliest girls in the country. I have suspected it some time, but I am now convinced." Catherine, Kitty, was disconcerted and made no answer. But Lydia, with perfect indifference, continued to express her admiration of Captain Carter and her hope of seeing him in the course of the day, as he was going the next morning to London. So earlier I said that Kitty and Lydia are often kind of grouped together in the thinking of some of the other characters and the narrative voice. But in the same passage where the militia are introduced, we are made aware of a fundamental and important, as it's going to turn out, important difference between the two sisters. So we see a crucial difference between Kitty and Lydia. Catherine was disconcerted and made no answer. Kitty does feel chastisement, to some extent at least. She is aware that this behaviour is frowned upon, shall we say, by Mr Bennet, and probably she knows by others as well. But Lydia responds with perfect indifference to the very light, frankly, reprimand by Mr Bennet. And furthermore, we can see here that she is much more forward in explicitly expressing her admiration for officers. And, as I've said, Lydia particularly mentions one officer by name, Captain Carter. Clearly, Captain Carter is Lydia's early favourite, as he is constantly on Lydia's lips, although we never meet him. For example, "Mamma," cried Lydia, "my aunt says that Colonel Forster and Captain Carter do not go so often to Miss Watson's as they did when they first came. She sees them now very often standing in Clark's library." So Lydia's sort of chasing down or getting intelligence on where she might happen to bump into Captain Carter. And later in the chapter, Lydia and Kitty walk to Meryton with Elizabeth. "If we make haste," said Lydia as they walked along, "perhaps we may see something of Captain Carter before he goes." So she's, actually venturing out into the world, going on these walks to Meryton and perhaps even to Clark's library, kind of explicitly to seek out the men, the officers she's interested in. Is a kind of implication there. And even when Lydia inveigles Mr Bingley into giving a ball at Netherfield a few chapters later, her first thought is for Captain Carter. So Mr Bingley says, "I am perfectly ready, I assure you, to keep my engagement, and when your sister is recovered," so Jane at this point is ill and recuperating at Netherfield. "So when your sister is recovered, you shall, if you please, name the very day of the ball, but you would not wish to be dancing while she is ill." Lydia declared herself satisfied. Oh yes, it would be much better to wait till Jane was well, and by that time, most likely, Captain Carter would be at Meryton again. So she's just bringing him in to this conversation about the Netherfield ball with Mr Bingley, seemingly without any reason there. So it's really sort of beautiful verisimilitude, life-likeness by Austen, by having Lydia kind of constantly mentioning this character, this Captain Carter, even when he's really not relevant at all. But Captain Carter seemingly never returns from London, or at least he is not mentioned in the novel as having returned. Lydia's fancy has moved on. Lydia's fancy has moved on to Mr Denny, who seems to be her new favourite and who will become important later in the novel as he is clearly an old acquaintance of Mr Wickham's. So the very first mention of Denny in Pride and Prejudice is by Lydia, and it comes when she interrupts Mr Collins as he is reading a sermon aloud. He is reading from Fordyce's Sermons. Pride and Prejudice reads, "Lydia gaped as he opened the volume, and before he had, with very monotonous solemnity, read 3 pages, she interrupted him with, 'You know, Mamma, that my uncle Phillips talks of turning away Richard, and if he does, Colonel Forster will hire him. My aunt told me so herself on Saturday. I shall walk to Meryton tomorrow to hear more about it, and to ask when Mr Denny comes back from town.'" So again, we've got Lydia's thoughts straying to a particular, this time new, officer, Mr Denny, and walking to pursue inquiries about him. And it's important, I think, that he is named. So we have another specific named officer by Lydia. And as a little aside, as ever, Jane Austen, you should always look into the details of Jane Austen because she never adds details in lightly. So I said that Mr Collins is reading from Fordyce's Sermons. That is James Fordyce's Sermons to Young Women, which was first published in 1766 and was incredibly popular, had gone through a dozen editions by the turn of the next century, by 1800. And we don't know exactly, obviously, what passage Mr Collins is reading, but some elements of Fordyce's Sermons are prescient when thinking about Lydia. So, for example, Mr Collins might have been reading this section. "When a daughter, it may be a favourite daughter, turns out unruly, foolish, wanton, when she disobeys her parents, disgraces her education, dishonours her sex, disappoints the hopes she had raised, when she throws herself away on a man unworthy of her, or if disposed, yet by his or her situation unqualified to make her happy. What her parents in any of these cases must necessarily suffer, we may conjecture, they alone can feel. And Lydia, of course, interrupts the sermon of Mr. Collins. So is this the section he's reading about unruly, foolish, wanton young women who disobeys her parents? Perhaps. And then in the next chapter we have the introduction of Mr. Wickham. And here is the text. So it starts off with Lydia's intention of walking to Meryton was not forgotten. So Lydia is clearly keen, still, the next morning to inquire whether Mr. Denny had returned from London and is determined to walk to Meryton to find out. Every sister except Mary agreed to go with her. So the phrasing here makes it clear that Lydia leads the expedition. Her sisters go with her. The attention of every lady was soon caught by a young man whom they had never seen before. Mr. Wickham is obviously supremely attractive. Throughout the next phase of the novel as well, particularly during the time when Elizabeth is drawn to and drawn in by Mr. Wickham, Lydia and Kitty's interest in Mr. Wickham serves the narrative purpose of reiterating that he is very attractive and very charming. So, in a way, Lydia and Kitty sort of present the view of every woman, apparently, in finding Mr. Wickham very attractive and very charming, and that might lead the reader to believe that this was a kind of universal view, and that Elizabeth is sort of lucky to be picked out by this extremely attractive, extremely charming man, or at least on the first reading of the novel. So the attention of every lady was soon caught by a young man whom they had never seen before, of most gentlemanlike appearance, walking with another officer on the other side of the way. The officer was the very Mr. Denny concerning whose return from London Lydia came to inquire. So the narrative voice reveals explicitly that Lydia, at this time at least, is preoccupied with Denny and is bringing along her sisters in this sort of endeavour to inquire about him, to walk to Meryton, to find out if he's there, and so on. And he bowed as they passed. All were struck with the stranger's air. All wondered who he could be, and Kitty and Lydia determined, if possible, to find out, and we wonder who was leading that finding out and that determination to find out, led the way across the street under pretence of wanting something in an opposite shop, and fortunately had just gained the pavement when the two gentlemen, turning back, had reached the same spot. And the tone of diction here, the wry "fortunately," rather reminds me of when Charlotte Lucas set out to meet Mr. Collins accidentally in the lane. There's that juxtaposition of pretense, under pretense, and fortunately, like with set out to meet him and accidentally. So Mr. Denny addressed them directly and entreated permission to introduce his friend, Mr. Wickham, who had returned with him the day before from town, and he was happy to say had accepted a commission in their corps. This was exactly as it should be, for the young man wanted only regimentals to make him completely charming. So in this line, could the narrative voice be taking on Lydia's and Kitty's first assessment of Mr. Wickham? That is, through free indirect discourse, using the diction and imagery of Lydia and Kitty. Is this their language? Is this their thinking? This was exactly as it should be, for the young man wanted only regimentals to make him completely charming. It's so over the top. Do we actually sort of ascribe this thought to Lydia and Kitty? We have been told, after all, that they could talk of nothing but officers, and all other considerations were worthless in their eyes when opposed to regimentals. And that's the first thing that they bring up. Yes, he's going to be in regimentals, then he will be completely charming. Whatever else, it's clear that Lydia is struck by Mr Wickham from his very first appearance. After Mr Wickham and Mr Darcy have their moment of recognition when they're standing on the streets in Meryton, the narrative voice returns to Lydia and Kitty and Mrs Phillips. Mr Denny and Mr Wickham walked with the young ladies to the door of Mr Phillips's house and then made their bows, in spite of Miss Lydia's pressing entreaties that they should come in. Lydia is being incredibly forward here. Inviting them in would be self-assured enough. It is not even her house, after all, that she's inviting them into. But she goes further, really, than is proper, than is polite, by making pressing entreaties plural. She is clearly not taking no for an answer easily. And even in spite of Mrs Phillips's throwing up the parlour window and loudly seconding the invitation. An example of the vulgarity or the impropriety that Mr Darcy talks about, shall we say, with Lizzie during the proposal scene. The Bennet women with Mr Collins then go into their aunt's house. Mrs Phillips was quite awed by such an excess of good breeding. This is about Mr Collins. But her contemplation of one stranger, Mr Collins, was soon put to an end by exclamations and inquiries about the other, Mr Wickham, of whom, however, she could only tell her nieces what they already knew. So by exclamations and inquiries, both of these words imply that it is Lydia who does the questioning. We know that she makes loud and long exclamations, and she repeatedly goes to her aunt's house to make enquiries. And that's the kind of text's word for Lydia's conversation when she goes to see her aunt, enquiries. Indeed, the very reason that they are in Meryton at all for this meeting is because Lydia had wanted to make inquiries about Denny. She could only tell her nieces what they already knew, that Mr Denny had brought him from London and that he was to have a lieutenant's commission in the Blankshire. She had been watching him the last hour, she said, as he walked up and down the street, and had Mr Wickham appeared, Kitty and Lydia would certainly have continued the occupation, but unluckily no one passed the windows now, except a few of the officers who, in comparison with the stranger, were become stupid, disagreeable fellows. So they, Lydia and Kitty, are clearly very taken with Wickham, as indeed apparently is Mrs Phillips, as she's been watching him from the window for an hour. But to know that no one of interest past the windows means that they were looking out for him. So Wickham has clearly become the new favourite. And I think, importantly, this is the first time that we have heard Lydia, or Kitty, say anything that is not favourable about an officer, any officer, officers in general, the idea of officers. And now, in comparison to Wickham, they have become stupid and disagreeable. So the first time that we hear Lydia and Kitty say anything negative at all about officers is in comparison to the new favourite, the new sort of exciting stranger, Mr Wickham. Some of them were to dine with the Phillipses the next day, and their aunt promised to make her husband call on Mr Wickham and give him an invitation also if the family from Longbourn would come in the evening. Lydia has made pressing entreaties for Wickham to come in, and one imagines that it was Lydia primarily who made the pressing entreaties that made Mrs Phillips promise to make her husband promise to invite Mr Wickham to this supper party. And the entire supper party, at which Lizzie first falls for Mr Wickham's tale of woe, is very much engineered by Mrs Phillips in response to Lydia's and Kitty's vociferous pursuits of Mr Wickham. And we might ask ourselves here, why does it sort of matter that Elizabeth Bennet does not really seem to mind or notice Lydia's forwardness here? Because she too wants to see more of Mr Wickham. So perhaps to some extent she endorses Lydia's forwardness or impropriety when she thinks it might help her get what she wants as well. Just a thought. This was agreed to, and Mrs Phillips protested that they would have a nice, comfortable, noisy game of lottery tickets and a little bit of hot supper afterwards. This is Lydia's idea of a pleasurable evening: noisiness and betting games. And as it turns out, Lydia is an enormous fan of the game of lottery tickets. So it seems that the whole evening that Mr Wickham is being invited to, the supper party, is the kind of evening that would appeal to Lydia Bennet far more than Elizabeth Bennet, let's say, or Jane Bennet. Elizabeth Bennet, at this point in the novel, is interested in Mr Wickham herself, which the reader's attention is initially drawn towards because we, like Lizzie, want to know the history of Mr Wickham and Mr Darcy. But sort of at the same time, perhaps while we're not really looking, the narrative also lets the reader know how Lydia responds to Mr Wickham, crucially. The novel then moves on to their supper party. So Mr Wickham was the happy man towards whom almost every female eye was turned, and Elizabeth was the happy woman by whom he finally seated himself. So almost every female eye was turned. We imagine that Lydia's was one of those. But again, what this sentence serves to remind readers of is just how physically attractive Mr Wickham is. We are sort of guided towards thinking how lucky Elizabeth is that he seems to be singling her out. If Lydia's eye, almost every female eye, was turned on Mr Wickham, then Lydia would have noticed that it's Elizabeth who Wickham singles out to go and sit next to. Are we then supposed to attribute some of Lydia's fancying or attraction to Mr Wickham, or desire to attract Mr Wickham herself? Are we supposed to see that to some extent as a kind of response of sibling rivalry to Mr Wickham singling out Lizzie? Later in the evening, we are told, Mr Wickham did not play at whist, and with ready delight he was received at the other table between Elizabeth and Lydia. This is a presageful sentence. Lydia receives Mr Wickham with as ready delight as Lizzie does. At first there seemed danger of Lydia's engrossing him entirely, for she was a most determined talker. Lydia goes on the offensive flirtation-wise and engrosses him entirely, at least for some time. But being likewise extremely fond of lottery tickets, she soon grew too much interested in the game, too eager in making bets and exclaiming after prizes to have attention for anyone in particular. At the end of the chapter, Lydia's fondness for the game of lottery tickets, which involves betting on the next card to be turned up, is reiterated. Lydia talked incessantly of lottery tickets, of the fish she had lost and the fish she had won. Fish here are the counters for the game. They are called fish as they were made of small, flat pieces of bone in the shape of fish. One might say that this suggests that Lydia is not that interested in Mr Wickham if she is so easily distracted by the game, and I accept that point. But Does Lydia's love of this betting game actually hint at a synergy between her and Wickham? They are both fond of gambling, and perhaps they both remain fonder of gambling games than each other after the marriage. Allowing for the common demands of the game, Mr Wickham was therefore at leisure to talk to Elizabeth, and she was very willing to hear him, though what she chiefly wished to hear she could not hope to be told, the history of his acquaintance with Mr Darcy. And this is masterful plotting here by Jane Austen in terms of reader distraction or misdirection. Because what this section with Lydia seems to do, at least on a first reading, is serve to act as an extra frustration for Lizzie and for the reader too. She wants to grill Mr Wickham about Mr Darcy, and we readers want to know how Mr Wickham knows Mr Darcy. And so this interruption with Lydia seems to be tension building. In narrative terms, that seems to be what the point is. We might also note the use of the word danger here. At first there seemed a danger of Lydia's engrossing him entirely. And again, it's kind of beautiful dual meaning in this word here, because we are experiencing this moment from Lizzie's perspective primarily. So at first there seemed a danger of Lydia's engrossing him entirely, and this danger is that it means that Lizzie and us readers aren't going to be able to hear about the history of Mr Wickham and Mr Darcy. But then when you read it again, you see that there is a different danger that is at play here. The danger of Lydia's being entirely engrossed by Mr Wickham. Structurally then, on a first read, we might see this as tension building, but it's only later that you come to see the significance of Lydia determinedly monopolising Wickham in this way. In the next chapter, the Bennet family contemplate the Netherfield ball, and the narrative voice takes the time to point out to readers that Lydia, and Kitty too, of course, is as taken with Mr Wickham as Lizzie is. So the prospect of the Netherfield ball was extremely agreeable to every female in the family. The happiness anticipated by Catherine and Lydia depended less on any single event or any particular person, for though they each, like Elizabeth, meant to dance half the evening with Mr Wickham, and there's a little joke here that 3 women mean to dance half the evening with 1 man. Mr Wickham, obviously, in that case, would be dancing for 1.5 evenings with the Bennet sisters. For though they each, like Elizabeth, meant to dance half the evening with Mr Wickham, he was by no means the only partner who could satisfy them, and a ball was, at any rate, a ball. So the narrative voice, I think, does a good job here at hinting of Lydia's partiality for Wickham without making it too blatant. When you first read the novel Pride and Prejudice, I think this sentence enhances the idea that Wickham is particularly desirable. If even unfussy Lydia and Kitty would particularly single him out for admiration. They then go to the Netherfield ball, and it is Lydia's questioning while at the Netherfield ball that leads to the Bennet women knowing why Mr Wickham is not present. The absolute fact of his absence was pronounced by his friend Denny, to whom Lydia eagerly applied, and who told them that Wickham had been obliged to go to town on business the day before and was not yet returned, to whom Lydia eagerly applied. And that was why the absence of Wickham was pronounced. So clearly, Lydia notices the absence of Wickham just as much as Lizzie does. Much later in Pride and Prejudice, this is in chapter 26, Lizzie writes to her another aunt, Mrs Gardiner, of Mr Wickham's defection. His apparent partiality had subsided. His attentions were over. He was the admirer of someone else, the text reads. And that someone else is a Miss King. The sudden acquisition of £10,000 was the most remarkable charm of the young lady to whom he was now rendering himself agreeable. Elizabeth is relatively sanguine about this, she tells her aunt. But Kitty and Lydia take his defection much more to heart than I do. They are young in the ways of the world and not yet open to the mortifying conviction that handsome young men must have something to live on as well as the plain. So Kitty and Lydia and their emotions are often mentioned together, as here. So Kitty and Lydia take his defection much more to heart than I do. And they're mentioned together, it seems to me, almost to dilute their feelings, or certainly overlook their individual feelings, and show them or present them as the mere silly girls that Mr. Bennet constantly calls them. But who leads this emotion, readers might wonder? Who particularly takes Wickham's defection to heart? Much later in the novel, Lizzie observes that Kitty was completely under Lydia's guidance. Completely under Lydia's guidance. Given that Lydia is the leader and Kitty is the perpetual follower, we can intuit this sentence to mean that it is Lydia primarily who has taken Wickham's apparent desertion personally. Lizzie and Mr. Bennet, and so us readers too, might see them united as mere silly girls whose desires are therefore trivial, arbitrary, transient. But we readers know, as is evident elsewhere, and as I've already mentioned, that Lydia is much more active in pursuing what she wants than Kitty is. Consider the quotation I mentioned earlier when Kitty is cowed by Mr. Bennet, referring to her and Lydia as silly girls. But Lydia continues with perfect indifference. So perhaps they should not be grouped together about something kind of emotional and personal, like taking Wickham's defection to heart. And Lydia's taking Wickham's defection to heart explains her later behaviour. Later in the novel, Elizabeth Bennet goes off to Hunsford to visit Mr. Collins and Charlotte, and Lydia and Kitty come to meet the returning Lizzie, along with Jane Bennet and Maria Lucas, at an inn en route. Lydia has clearly been keeping tabs on Mr. Wickham, as it is she who reports on what happened between him and Miss King. So she clearly has taken his defection to heart, because she's following what Mr. Wickham is doing with the lady he has kind of defected to. And it's in this section of the novel that she first refers to him as Dear Wickham, something she will continue to do after they are married, when he was her dear Wickham on every occasion. Clearly, Lydia and Wickham have been growing closer while Lizzie has been away. Now I have got some news for you, said Lydia, as they sat down at table. What do you think? It is excellent news, capital news, about a certain person we all like. It is almost as if Lydia is competing with Lizzie over Wickham. Jane and Elizabeth looked at each other, and the waiter was told he need not stay. Lydia laughed and said, "Aye, that is just like your formality and discretion. You thought the waiter must not hear, as if he cared. I dare say he often hears worse things said than I am going to say. Well, but now for my news. It is about dear Wickham." As I said, the first time she calls him dear Wickham. Too good for the waiter, is it not? There is no danger of Wickham's marrying Mary King. There's for you. She is gone down to her uncle at Liverpool, gone to stay. Wickham is safe. Lydia is clearly on his side. And Mary King is safe, added Elizabeth, and Lizzie now is clearly not on Wickham's side. Added Elizabeth, safe from a connection, imprudent as to fortune. She is a great fool for going away if she liked him. This is Lydia. This is another prescient line. Lydia considers Mary King to be a fool for giving up on a man if she liked him. But I hope there is no strong attachment on either side, said Jane. I'm sure there is not on his. I will answer for it. He never cared 3 straws about her. Who could, about such a nasty little freckled thing? The Oxford English Dictionary defines answer for as to give a justificatory account of. So Lydia feels the need to justify Wickham's obviously fortune-hunting behaviour. She claims sure of him. I am sure there is not on his side. I will answer for it. It seems there's a growing kind of personal closeness or understanding between Lydia and Wickham here. Dear me, we had such a good piece of fun the other day at Colonel Forster's. Kitty and me were to spend the day there, and Mrs. Forster promised to have a little dance in the evening. By the by, Mrs. Forster and me are such friends. And so she asked the 2 Harringtons to come, but Harriet was ill, and so Pen was forced to come by herself. And then what do you think we did? We dressed up Chamberlain in women's clothes on purpose to pass for a lady. Only think what fun. Not a soul knew of it but Colonel and Mrs. Forster and Kitty and me, except my aunt, for we were forced to borrow one of her gowns. And you cannot imagine how well he looked. When Denny and Wickham, important that Wickham is there, and Pratt, and 2 or 3 more of the men came in, they did not know him in the least. Lord, how I laughed, and so did Mrs. Forster. I thought I should have died, and that made the men suspect something, and then they soon found out what was the matter. But in amongst all this pouring out, the important point is that this cross-dressing episode means that conventional, traditional codes of propriety have been breached, and implies that standard gendered roles are slippery amongst this set, and Wickham is part of this set. He's mentioned by name, and it's important, I think, that he's there as part of this, because 2 related of the most conventional gender roles in courtship at the time was that the man pursues and the woman is the pursued. In the words of Henry Tilney in Northanger Abbey, man has the advantage of choice, woman only the power of refusal. But this episode suggests that Lydia is very willing to upend conventional behaviour, particularly relating to gender roles, and become the pursuer herself. She wants the advantage of choice, and it's important that Wickham is there while these apparent certainties of gender are breached. The text continues, with such kinds of histories of their parties and good jokes did Lydia, assisted by Kitty's hints and additions. So we know that it is primarily Lydia who is talking, and we might imagine that this is true for many of the situations in which Lydia and Kitty are grouped together. Lydia, assisted by Kitty's hints and additions, endeavoured to amuse her companions all the way to Longbourn. Elizabeth listened as little as she could, but there was no escaping the frequent mention of Wickham's name. Again, there is fabulous misdirection here by the narrative voice. So this scene comes hot on the heels of Mr. Darcy's first failed proposal to Lizzie, and his long letter explaining and detailing the lies of Mr. Wickham. What the no escaping does is focuses the reader's attention onto Lizzie's hearing of Mr. Wickham's name. She does not want to hear his name, and so no escaping gives the reader a sense of Lizzie's torment on being stuck in a carriage trying to avoid listening to Lydia's prattle when she's kind of processing everything that Darcy has told her about Mr Wickham. But what readers should not lose sight of is that Lydia keeps mentioning Wickham's name. There was no escaping the frequent mention of Wickham's name. It seems fairly obvious that Lydia is preoccupied with Mr Wickham. When Lydia anticipates going to Brighton, the narrative voice reveals that she intends to flirt with as many officers as possible. So the text reads that in Lydia's imagination, a visit to Brighton comprised every possibility of earthly happiness. She saw, with the creative eye of fancy, the streets of that gay bathing place covered with officers. She saw herself the object of attention to tens and to scores of them at present unknown. She saw all the glories of the camp, its tents stretched forth in beauteous uniformity of lines, crowded with the young and the gay, the dazzling with scarlet. And to complete the view, she saw herself seated beneath a tent, tenderly flirting with at least 6 officers at once. So Jane Austen crafts the text subtly. Lydia will flirt with any and all officers, apparently, even greedily with 6 officers at once. But the text had earlier made it clear that she does have a penchant for Mr Wickham above the others. And I love the sardonic tenderly here, tenderly flirting with at least 6 officers at once. It's kind of oxymoronic image there. So this is how Lydia imagines Brighton. But how did she actually behave when she was there? A hint is given via her letters to Kitty. Once away in Brighton, Lydia writes back to Kitty, who is at home at Longbourn, about what is happening. Her letters to Kitty, the narrative voice tells us, though rather longer than those to Mrs Bennet, were much too full of lines under the words to be made public. So in the Regency period, when writing to your family, it was common that you might have sections of a letter that contained communal details that could be read aloud to other members of the family, and some sections that were not to be made public. And you might demarcate that by underlining certain words. So parts of Lydia's letters are not to be made public, i.e. they are for Kitty's eyes only. Lydia is not mentioned again in the narrative until Jane writes to Lizzie of Lydia's elopement with Mr Wickham. And Jane writes, "What I have to say relates to poor Lydia. An express came at 12 last night, just as we were all gone to bed, from Colonel Forster, to inform us that she was gone off to Scotland with one of his officers, to own the truth, with Wickham. Imagine our surprise. To Kitty, however, it does not seem so wholly unexpected." And then in the second letter that Jane writes to Lizzie, Jane writes, "Poor Kitty has anger for having concealed their attachment, but as it was a matter of confidence, one cannot wonder." Lydia had expressly written then of her attachment to Wickham to Kitty. Despite what Lydia had imagined about Brighton and tenderly flirting with at least 6 officers at once, her partiality for Wickham had clearly continued. She hadn't been writing to Kitty of officers in general, as she had to her mother, Mrs Bennet, but of her attachment to Wickham in particular. Their elopement, indeed, is even somewhat expected by Kitty. What does all this mean then? So Lydia first mentions particularly Captain Carter. He soon disappears from the scene. And then Lydia mentions Mr Denny, particularly by name. But once Mr Wickham is on the scene, Lydia does not mention another officer particularly by name again in the same way that she had before, in terms of inquiring about them, seeking them out, going after them, etc. She even calls him her dear Wickham. She does refer to Colonel Forster, but this is in relation to Mrs. Forster and going off to Brighton. There are no other particular officers mentioned in the same way again after Wickham appears on the scene. Lizzie, we remember, had never perceived while the regiment was in Hertfordshire that Lydia had any partiality for him. But she was convinced that Lydia wanted only encouragement to attach herself to anybody. Sometimes one officer, sometimes another had been her favourite, as their attentions had raised them in her opinion. Her affections had continually been fluctuating, but never without an object. Yes, readers see that Lydia's affections do fluctuate from one officer to another, as I've outlined, but there is not a particular other officer that replaces Mr. Wickham in terms of Lydia mentioning him after Wickham clearly becomes her favourite. So Lydia's affections do not continually fluctuate, they stop at Wickham. At the time that Mr. Wickham had been stationed in Meryton, Lizzie had been blinded by her own concerns for and interest in Mr. Wickham, both in terms of her flirtation with him and in terms of the history between Wickham and Mr. Darcy. Perhaps this statement by Lizzie, then, is more evidence of Lizzie's self-absorption regarding Mr. Wickham than evidence of Lydia's indifference. Lizzie had not perceived that Lydia had any partiality for Mr. Wickham, but the narrative voice does show that Lydia had singled him out, if you look for the clues along the way, which means that the elopement does not come as completely out of the blue as one might imagine on a first reading of Pride and Prejudice. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel where I analyse classic literature, then do subscribe. And if you have liked the video, then do please press the thumbs up button. It helps me out in YouTube's algorithm. Thank you to everyone who has supported my channel. Your support really is appreciated. And what do you think? Do you think that Lydia particularly had her eye on Mr. Wickham? Let me know in the comments below.